When two gruesome murders happened in the East End of London during the spring of 1888, the police were baffled. As the relatively newly established detective unit set to work to try and work out what was going on, they didn't realise that perhaps the perpetrator was gearing up for something far worse than what had already happened. The occurrences in Whitechapel were confusing, to say the least, and the police were doing their best to try and find those responsible. But maybe the lack of arrests and justice for these victims played an important part in what was to happen next. Splashed all over the papers was the story of Martha Tabram, a woman who was struggling to make ends meet, and so she had to carry out the oldest profession in the world. When her body was discovered in George Yard, a tenement building complex which was said to be a known dangerous area, the newspapers played a huge part in spreading the word about the vicious murder. Martha went unidentified for a few weeks, and her autopsy photo was circulated on the streets of London. Part helpful, part spectacle, but it sent a strong message. The women of Whitechapel were unknowns, and their communities feared the repercussions they may face from identifying such a victim, creating a lawless and dangerous land in which evil could lurk. Today on Macabre London, we head to the East End of London in the late days of August 1888 to uncover the story of the Whitechapel murderer, Jack the Ripper, and more importantly, the injustices his victims faced. Welcome back to the next episode of my Crime and Punishment in London series. I'm Nikki Druce, your host with a silent G, and in the last episode we touched on the first two victims of the Whitechapel murders, Emma Elizabeth Stride and Martha Tabram. We explored how these first two victims in this period of terror which hung over Whitechapel were discovered, investigated, and how their murders were just the precursor to something much worse, which the police didn't see coming, and which would go on to change crime and investigations forever. Now, if you're new here and this is your first time listening to or watching Macabre London, then make sure you pick up with the first few episodes in this Crime and Punishment series so you're up to speed. They're all there on my channel now. I do make it so you can pick up with any episode as a standalone piece, but you'll get way more out of it if you know the timeline up to this point. But if you've been here for the duration, welcome back and let's dive straight back in. But if you want to get more of the show, I'd love for you to join me and the rest of the Ghoul Gang on patreon.com/Macabre London to be part of the exclusive club. It really is the best way to support the show to keep it going in return for extra bonus content, such as my spooky bedtime stories. I'm currently reading The War of the Worlds over there. But if that's not for you right now, no bother, just a big thank you for listening, spreading the word, supporting our sponsors, and being there. That's the most important thing. But now it's time to dust off your comfiest walking boots because we're about to go back out on the beat and pick up with the next part of Crime and Punishment in the capital city. August 1888 was a washout in London. The weather was abysmal, one of the rainiest on record, and the sudden heavy downpours were frequent, flooding the streets. Those living in slums suffered from leaks and flooded basements, and the frequent thunderstorms and lightning strikes caused damage to property and factories. Outside of the city, the extreme weather battered crops, and gale-force winds played havoc with bringing food into the city. Trains were affected as lengths of track were submerged, and with food being scarce, houses uninhabitable, and reports in the papers of the poor being at their wits' end, things were incredibly grim. These horrendous conditions had a knock-on effect, and as people were struggling to survive, they had no other option than to put themselves first. During the floods and storms which battered London, the most vulnerable suffered. Those who had no other option abandoned their children, and some went as far as to make things final. During this time, a number of children were fished out of the Thames and sent to mortuaries. Some found dead from exposure, and some, just babies, were found discarded in bundles and left to perish. It was a desperate time which forced people to act to save themselves. Now, what we also have to remember is that the mortality rate was incredibly high for children back then anyway. There was no birth control, and many people couldn't afford to have children. If they were to turn them over to an orphanage, their life could be horrific. Baby farmers were also a real threat, and so even if a child was turned over in good faith, there was no guarantee they wouldn't be thrown in the Thames like many others. Only 1 in 3 children born during the 1800s lived to see their 5th birthday, and if you were poor, those odds only rose, victims of their social standing. Death was no stranger to the slums of Whitechapel, and people often lamented that taking a trip with the Reaper was a better option than living there, something which wasn't taken lightly in a religious society. But in Whitechapel, there was no God. They had been forsaken and left to rot. A touch of gallows humour definitely helped in such trying times, but the general consensus was that the 2.5 million poor, half of the capital's population in the late 1800s, were having a terrible time, which made them constantly question their purpose, which no wonder had a huge effect on their mental health and made them consider doing the worst thing imaginable. Alongside death, walking hand in hand in the gloom of the East End, was depravity. In 1885, there had been an act passed, the Criminal Law Amendment, to try and regulate sex work by using police to survey brothels, a plan to try and put off men from going to them, which in turn would affect custom and eventually, hopefully, close them down. However, the police commissioner at the time, Sir Charles Warren, thought this was a waste of time, and so he called off the surveillance. But the ongoing effect was that many women stepped away from the safety of brothels, well, the implied safety they held, and went instead out onto the streets, working on their own. The attitudes towards women back then were that if you were outside after it got dark and you were alone, you were more than likely selling your wares. One woman, who had a full-time day job, dared to go out after 9 p.m. to buy a pair of gloves on Regent Street and was arrested for doing so, as surely no self-respecting woman would be out on her own at night without being up to something untoward. Elizabeth Cass found herself in court for daring to be a woman outside alone, and as Elizabeth was a middle-class woman, the preposterous situation was laughed out of court and overthrown. I doubt this happened for many lower-class women, but it meant the police were told to stop arresting women just for being women outside after dark, and so sex work was allowed to just happen in the streets from then on out, making it less risky in terms of arrest, but far more dangerous in the amount of women that were now working in areas which were known to be dodgy after dark. As one particular street in Whitechapel came to be known for the most depraved behaviours and its name became synonymous with bad things, pickpockets, thieves, drunks, violent characters and working women would openly brawl in the street. Unwashed children with dirty faces would sit on the outside cobbles and watch the grown-ups fight, doomed to repeat it themselves if they even lived to see it, the pitiful houses crumbling all around them. As the sun would set, the streets would become incredibly dark. The area was without many gas lamps which had been installed in upper-class areas of town, and it was common for people to walk around with a box of matches in their pocket and would huddle by the gas lamps which were few and far between. If you didn't know the area, chances were you'd be quite lost if you ended up there after dark, and that's something you really wouldn't want, as the chances of bumping into someone nefarious were pretty high. Now, there were some residents of the East End who didn't fear the dark, particularly if they were full of Dutch courage. One particular woman, whose name was Mary Ann Nicholls, but who preferred the name Polly, was not afraid of the dark, which unfortunately would lead to her downfall. Polly had at one time lived a fairly regular life. She was born into a working-class family, got married at just 18, and subsequently gave birth to 5 children. But as the years rolled by, Polly developed an alcohol addiction. After her father accused her husband of cheating on her with the family midwife, things were strained for the couple, and Polly's addiction spiralled out of control. Eventually, she upped and left her family and relinquished the care of her children to their father. Polly tried several jobs, all menial labour, but eventually found herself living in a workhouse, basically a labour prison, but the owner liked her, and so she managed to find her a housemaid position at a wealthy home in Wandsworth. Polly liked the job and wrote to her father to let him know she was doing all right for herself, and often had the house to herself with little to do. But with that idleness, the demons of drink began to once more take hold, and before long, Polly was back to her old ways. The owners of the house were said to be religious and non-drinkers, and so their differing lifestyles clashed, and when it was found that Polly had stolen some clothing from the lady of the house, she was dismissed. Rather than go back to the workhouse, Polly decided to sleep rough in Soho, and it's believed this is when she turned to sex work to provide herself with an independent income. Polly, who was now 44, was found on the street by a charity that worked to relocate rough sleepers, and she was sent to a boarding house in Whitechapel. The rough sleeping and sex work had only exacerbated Polly's addiction, and now she was often seen out in the street, drunk as a skunk. She ended up sharing a room with an older woman, and they slept in the same bed. She collected a payout from her estranged husband once a week, which was paid to the local authority for her to collect. But she would often burn through this without paying her lodging fee, and so she was frequently turned out of her accommodation until she could pay, leaving her wandering the streets at night, drunk and alone. It's no wonder that on one evening, when this exact pattern of events happened, that Polly would inevitably end up as the first canonical victim of Jack the Ripper. Now, if you want to experience what it's like to explore the Victorian era at the turn of the century, but with the sci-fi twist, then I've got something for you which you're gonna love. Now, you know, I can't resist a bit of immersive theatre, and this one really is one of my absolute favourites. I've been there more times than I can count, and I keep going back for more, because every single time is like stepping into a brand new world, or more accurately, into the middle of a Martian invasion, which is equal parts fun, thrilling, and at some points, just the right amount of terrifying. You can experience H.G. Wells' classic tale like never before in Jeff Wayne's The War of the Worlds, The Immersive Experience. This groundbreaking production merges Jeff Wayne's legendary musical works with cutting-edge technology, live actors, virtual reality, 3D sound and projection mapping, creating an unforgettable immersive spectacle. And just in case you're not quite sure what it would be like to experience a Martian invasion, let me paint a picture for you. You'll slide down a Martian handling machine claw, fly to Mars in a hot air balloon, have a drink in the Redweed Bar mid-apocalypse to steady your nerves, and you'll come face to face with 300-foot tall fighting machines, all while Jeff Wayne's iconic music plays around you. It's not just me who's obsessed with this experience either. The reviews speak for themselves. This is the world's #1 rated immersive experience on TripAdvisor, and it's won 12 major awards with over 18,000 5-star reviews. That's not to be sniffed at. And because I'm such a fan, and I know you'll love it too, I've got you a discount so you can go and enjoy the fun. Use the code Macabre10, that's MACABRE10 at checkout for £10 off 2 or more tickets. It's valid on all ticket types for any time slot up until the 31st of December 2025. But don't wait around, the offer runs out on the 30th of November 2025, so you'll want to get it booked ASAP. Book now at thewaroftheworldsimmersive.com with my exclusive discount and prepare for one of the best nights out in London and perhaps of your life. Trust me, once is not enough, you will be hooked, and I wouldn't blame you if you wanted to go back several times over, because I have. And you never know, I might see you there. Polly was seen by a couple of her other fellow streetwalkers just after 1 a.m. on the 31st of August 1888. So drunk that she sat for a while, slumped against a greengrocer's door. One of the women tried to take her back to her lodgings, but she said she couldn't as she didn't have enough money to pay, and as she was incoherent and boisterous, the other worker left her to her own devices. At around 3:40 a.m, a man was walking along Bucks Row when he saw what he thought was a discarded tarpaulin in the street. As his eyes tried to focus on the mass in the dark, he lit a match to inspect it further. As he bent down, the eyes of a woman stared back at him as she lay on the damp pavement. Just as he'd seen this terrible sight in front of him, another man came walking along the dark road, and the pair observed together their gruesome find, but they were not quite sure what they were seeing. The second man touched the face of the woman, and as it was still warm, the first ran to find the nearest policeman, as they weren't sure if she was just unconscious or indeed dead. As the policeman arrived, PC Jonas Misen, the two men went on their way to work and left him to it, but not before they'd covered the woman up from the waist down, as her skirt had been left lifted, and it seemed only right that she was provided at least some dignity. The lantern of another policeman, who happened to be passing Bucks Row, PC John Thane, shone out bright in the gloom of the pitch-black streets, and this attracted the attention of PC Misen, who called out to him. As PC Thane got closer, the lantern began to paint light over the woman's body, and revealed the pool of blood she was laying in, and that she had a knife wound across her neck. The two officers used the light from the lantern to illuminate their surroundings to see if A, the perpetrator was hiding in the shadows, if there were any footprints leading away or any carriage tracks, and to look for any discarded weapons. But alas, there was nothing to be found. As the uncertainty turned to fact that this woman was indeed dead, the two constables followed the protocol for finding a body in the street. Misen stayed with the corpse, and Thane went to fetch the doctor. It was now approaching 4 a.m, and the sun was just starting to think about rising, and before long, commuters and the folk in the surrounding houses would be waking up and getting ready for work, so the officers knew they had to work quickly to make sure everything was cleared up before the residents began to gather. When Dr. Llewellyn arrived, he made a cursory inspection of the woman and delivered the life extinct verdict, which allowed the police to move to the next part of the process. Dr. Llewellyn and the two police officers fetched a handcart and loaded the woman onto it and took her to the closest mortuary in Old Montague Street, just over a 5-minute walk. Once in the mortuary, Dr. Llewellyn was able to carry out a proper examination and noted that she had, as the police constables had established, been killed as a result of not one but two very deep wounds to her throat, so deep that her head was almost severed. However, that's where Dr. Llewellyn stopped his examination, and managed to miss that hiding underneath the woman's dress lay far worse. Now, only for the purposes of how this case was investigated by the police and just how this major information was missed, some of the injury details are important to note, but I won't be going into detail for each victim, merely noting the similarities to this first canonical victim. Under the woman's skirts, Dr. Llewellyn had failed to notice that the victim had been slashed several times deeply across the abdomen and nether regions, and that the large knife used was more than likely one which belonged to a trade, such as a butcher, shoemaker, or even a woodworker. When the inspector from District J, John Spratling, arrived at the mortuary on behalf of the Bethnal Green jurisdiction, he looked over the body, revealing the extensive injuries to the abdomen, and quickly sent for Dr. Llewellyn to return, and what can only be assumed, for a bit of a dressing down. However, despite his original cursory glance at the poor woman's body, he did offer up perhaps some of the first ever blood splatter analysis ever used in the investigation process of a murder case. Llewellyn posed that this woman had been attacked by the perpetrator, covering her mouth and then inflicting the neck wounds, lowering them to the ground, and then waited for her to die before carrying out the other cuts to the abdomen. The reason being that there was very little blood found around the bottom half of the body, which suggested that her circulation had ceased, or else there would have been spray and soaking of her clothes. He further suggested that the overall attack would have lasted less than 5 minutes, and that the perpetrator may have had some anatomical knowledge to know that the method they chose wouldn't be particularly messy. So with the method potentially pinned down, now the police were looking for a motive, so they had to find out who this woman was. The victim had no identifiable possessions on them. In fact, what they did have was very meagre. No money, no house keys, just a hair comb, a hanky, and a broken piece of mirror. Her petticoats, well worn, did reveal a clue, They were embroidered with "Property of Lambeth Workhouse," and so the investigator paid a visit to see if anyone may be able to come and help identify the body. The matron of the workhouse didn't know the woman, but another lodger under their care did recognise the body and confirmed this was sadly Polly Nichols. As the day ticked by, the residents and properties on Bucks Row were all searched by police, who went door to door to try and find any information about this woman, or any potential evidence which may reveal her killer. One of the street walkers who had left Polly in the street said she may know who the body was, and so she was called to the mortuary and identified that Polly was the poor victim, having seen her drunk and disorderly the night before, leaving her alone in the street. With 2 corroborating reports that this was Polly Nichols, the parish were notified, who tracked down her estranged husband. Polly's husband had ceased her maintenance payment when he found out that her drinking had become out of control and that she was selling herself on the street. Now, here he was staring at her lifeless body in a mortuary. With perhaps some guilt at his ex-wife's situation, he exclaimed to her corpse, "I forgive you, as you are, for what you have been to me." With Polly having been identified, it was now down to officers to try and ascertain exactly who they were looking for, and if anyone knew anything about Nichols' situation. Now, here seems to be a good time to mention that the reason we don't know a lot about the Ripper case is because a lot of the police files have been lost, destroyed in error, or just lost to time. After all, when this was happening, it was in a rough area of London, and the subsequent investigation didn't uncover much of anything. So as the years passed, plenty of pertinent information was destroyed, something which has no doubt worked to elevate this case to its mythical status, as perhaps the world's best-known serial killer. So unfortunately, the actual investigative work straight after Polly's death has been lost to time, but the notes from her inquest, surprisingly, have survived. The inquest began the day after Polly's murder and was held in Whitechapel at the Working Lads Institute. The jury were collated and sworn in, and then they all made a sombre trip to the mortuary to view Polly's body, something which I'm very pleased is no longer part of jury service today. Can you even imagine? However, we have to remember that death was ironically a part of everyday life for many Victorians. After viewing the body and having been given an overview of the supposed method of murder and the fatal injury sustained, the jury were presented with the evidence the police had managed to gather in less than 24 hours. On day 1, the 2 police constables gave evidence of how they discovered the body, called Dr. Llewellyn, and took Polly to the mortuary. Polly's father was also asked to provide a character statement for Polly, in which he said he hadn't seen his daughter since April of that year, and confirmed details of her previous marriage, confirming he didn't know for any reason why anyone would want to harm her. Dr. Llewellyn gave his report about his findings when he examined Polly's body, and how he noted that apart from some bruising to the face, which may have been caused by the clamping of the perpetrator's hand over her mouth, and apart from the already reported wounds on her body, there was no other trauma, which suggested this was done quickly and at close range. It may well be that whomever that did this approached Polly as she was passed out from her drunkenness and took advantage of her inebriated state. There was also no sign of intercourse having taken place, and that the wounds were more than likely made by a left-hander. Unlike Martha Tabram's murder, Polly's injuries were all inflicted by the same weapon, a large bladed knife used in a forceful and violent manner. On day 2 of the inquest, Polly's former husband was called to speak about his relationship with his estranged wife, after confirming he'd not seen her for 3 years and saying she'd left of her own accord, partly as a result of her alcoholism. Now, interestingly, during the inquest, no one could confirm what Polly's profession was, and many claimed they didn't know what she did for a living. Sadly, no one seemed to have a strong relationship with her. Many people only knew her in passing or through situation or circumstance, and it appeared she didn't really have any strong bonds with anyone in her day-to-day life. On the night of Polly's murder, no one heard anything, even though she was killed right next door to an occupied home. It seems that the perpetrator happened upon lonely Polly and decided to strike, thinking no one would miss her, and it seemed they weren't far from the truth. After 3 days of the inquest and no real progress in finding her killer, It was ruled that Mary Ann Nicholls, aka Polly, had been murdered by person or persons unknown, the third ruling of its kind for Whitechapel's women in just a few months. Now, even though death was no stranger to the streets of the East End, cold-blooded murder was. 3 bodies found within such a short time frame, all occurring within yards of each other, made the fear of the residents rise. Even if the police were trying their best to solve the crimes, the lack of any arrests made the public nervous, as every day which passed left the residents at risk, and for many not able to earn a living as they feared any and all strangers. As the press began reporting on Polly's case, they instantaneously connected the dots of the 3 murders. Unconfirmed theories and thoughts were allowed to be published with no hard evidence, and interference with the police's investigation was a daily occurrence. As the pressure was piled on the police, and particularly the Met Commissioner, Sir Charles Warren, the bobbies were desperate to make an arrest. As many newspapers spread misinformation and inappropriate views of the residents of Whitechapel, particularly immigrants, the papers had a field day, inadvertently allowing the perpetrator to continue on right under their noses. After a couple of false arrests, just based on scant witness reports claiming the murderer may be Jewish, the residents of Whitechapel now had another fear to deal with: false arrest. The police, papers, and general public were all desperately wanting to solve the murders, but they were all leading each other in circles. But whilst the authorities were distracted, the murderer seized the opportunity to strike again. However, they were aware that the net was tightening and that they were more than likely on borrowed time. So, would they be able to kill again? To find out what happens next in Whitechapel and just how the police are going to try and solve a case which requires them to hear a pin drop above a crowd of screaming voices, you'll have to join me next time on the next episode of Crime and Punishment in the Capital City. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Macabre London. Let me know what your thoughts were about that episode on Spotify or my social media. And if you don't have any thoughts or theories, but you've made it this far and you just want to let me know you're a true part of the Ghoul Gang, then please leave me the candle emoji in the comments on YouTube or Spotify so we can try and illuminate some of those dingy alleyways we'd rather avoid. If you want to join my exclusive community on Patreon and get a peek behind the curtain, along with early and ad-free episodes, then head on over to patreon.com/Macabre London. You get to be part of the Ghoul Gang, and you get exclusive access to the whole back catalogue of content over there. And as Halloween is coming, you may want to get in there to make sure you snag an exclusive Halloween goodie bag for the top 2 tiers. You also unlock my spooky bedtime story audiobook readings. I'm currently reading War of the Worlds over there, so if that sounds like something you'd like, then I'll look forward to seeing you over there so I can personally welcome you to the Ghoul Gang. A big thanks to my amazing top tier Patreon producers: Christina, Christoph, Heather's Leg, Mary, Matilda, Ravel, Sally, Sam, Sarah, Terry and Veronica, and all of our other fantastic patrons. If you want your name read out in the episodes or listed in the show notes, join us on Patreon. Don't forget to check out the War of the Worlds immersive experience and use the code MACABRE10 to get £10 off 2 tickets or more. If you're looking for something really fun and different to do, then this ticks all those boxes, and I know you're gonna love it. Let me know if you go, I'd love to hear how you found it. Thanks for joining me for another macabre tale from the city's past. I've been Nikki Druce, remember to stay spooky, and I'll see you ghouls next time.